Greetings, class, once again. In this last section of the unit, I would like to talk about the characteristics of life. Now, life is an interesting term because there's not just one word that describes life. There are actually many traits that together help us to define what a living thing is. To be considered living, you have to have all these traits. You can't have just part of them. Every single one of these traits is necessary to be considered alive. And it's appropriate to end our unit studying the characteristics of living things because, after all, what are we studying this year? Biology. And what is biology? The study of life, bio and ology. Now, there are some things that walk a fine line where they're very close to living things, like, for example, viruses. But viruses are not true living things because they don't have all of the characteristics of living things. So in these next couple of slides, what I'd look at are all the individual traits that are necessary to help scientists define something as living. So let us begin. First characteristic all living things share in common. All living things are based on a universal genetic code. And that genetic code is composed of a very important molecule called DNA, also known as deoxyribonucleic acid. The molecules of DNA are used to create all of the variety of life that we see. It's basically the same as a computer programming code. The genetic code is the code that defines who we are and what each living thing is. All living things are different, but they all share the same basic molecule, which is DNA. And in later units, we'll talk far more in detail about what DNA is, how DNA is used to create all of our traits, protein synthesis, etc. But for this particular section here, today, all we need to worry about is the fact that all living things are made of DNA. And all living things share a universal genetic code written by the world's first and greatest programmer, God. That information is then copied and passed on from parent to offspring, generation after generation after generation. Another characteristic all living things share in common is that they grow and develop. Now, growth and development are two different things. Remember, we talked about it in class. Growing is about getting larger. From when you were born as a little tiny infant to today, which you're much taller, much heavier. You're just bigger. But you've also developed over all these years. Development, of course, means to become more complex or more sophisticated. Think of all the things you can do today that you were not able to do as a little tiny baby. Like, for example, watching this video clip and processing it. This is something you could not have done when you were a baby. All living things will grow, even cells, and they will all develop and become more complex over time. Another characteristic all living things share in common is they respond to their environment. All living things have to recognize changes or triggers in their environment known as stimuli. These signals are very important. It could mean danger is coming. It could mean food is coming. It could mean a change in seasons and it's time to migrate. These stimuli are triggers in which organisms have to respond. For example, if you're a predator and you don't recognize the coloring in a particular type of prey, for example, if it's red or black or yellow, those signal codes that warn something might be poisonous, could be quite dangerous. All living things have to be able to respond to changes in their environments, stimulus and response. For example, when I had a fish tank as a youngster, I can remember many times turning the light on to feed them. And as soon as I turned the light on, the fish would move right to the top of the fish tank before I'd even put the food in. They had associated the stimulus of the light with food, and their response was to go to the top because they sure did enjoy those flakes. Another characteristic all living things share in common is, of course, the ability to reproduce. Obviously, living things have to reproduce because if they don't reproduce, they won't produce offspring, and the species or line will die off. Now, there's two methods of reproduction in nature that we'll be looking at during the course of the semester. There's sexual reproduction, which involves two parents joining together to create a new offspring of genetically mixed material. And there's also another type of reproduction called asexual reproduction, in which one parent, say for example a cell, might divide in two to create two identical daughter cells. Each has some benefits and drawbacks. For example, sexual reproduction provides genetic diversity, whereas asexual reproduction provides a much quicker means of reproduction. Living things also have to maintain a stable internal condition. This is known as homeostasis. It is very important for organisms to maintain this balance. For example, your body operates best at a temperature of 98.6 degrees Fahrenheit or 37 degrees Celsius. Your body also likes a certain amount of sodium in its diet, certain blood pressure, all these kind of things. And that's the same even at the cellular level. Individual cells like to have a certain amount of water in their vacuoles, a certain amount of gases, those kind of things. So homeostasis, maintaining a stable internal condition, is a characteristic you will also find in all living things. Living things also have to obtain and use material and energy to grow, develop, and reproduce. The combination of all these actions together, all the different types of reactions that have to take place in a living thing, is known as metabolism. Even at the cellular level, cells have to undergo these processes of capturing energy, breaking it down, releasing the molecules of energy, and converting them into forms of energy that can be used by the cells. Things like cellular respiration and photosynthesis, which we'll be looking at later in the year, are important examples. Excretion, digestion, all these things go together hand in hand with metabolism. All living things have to acquire some form of energy, and they have to break it down and turn it into forms of energy that the actual cells can use. Living things are also made of cells. Cells are the building blocks of all living things. They're the smallest units of an organism and are considered fully alive themselves. Cells have all the characteristics of life that we have talked about. And cells are the main units of structure and function in every single living thing. Finally, all living things evolve or change over time. There's plenty of evidence throughout history, fossilized remains, DNA information, structural information looking at different organisms of similar species. And we'll be looking at a lot of this later in the year. But organisms do change over time. They call it evolution. And if organisms didn't change and adapt to those types of changes that occur in their environment, it might be very difficult for them to survive over time, and they might become extinct. So organisms do change in successive generations as time passes. And those traits that are beneficial are passed on to the organism and to the species over time. And that will conclude our lesson on characteristics of living things, and will conclude our information for the unit. Be sure to make sure you watch all the video segments in addition to going through your notes, going through all the readings that we had for the chapter, doing the practice tests at the end of each section and at the end of the unit, looking over the homework assignments that we've had and also the labs, and that will help prepare you for the test. And don't forget to do the study guide that was given to you as well.